All of the presenters, except for Joe O-Brien, who is up next, are actually present. Joe would be here, but had to pre-record because he is actually on a prescribed fire in Ecuador as we speak. So actually getting fire on the ground is always going to take precedence in my mind. But with that, I'll go ahead and do a quick introduction for Joe so you know a little bit about him. And he has promised to answer any questions via email that cannot be answered by any of the other presenters today during the panel discussion. And I will put his email in the chat so that you'll have it. But since joining the Forest Service in 2002, Joe's research is centered on wildland fire science, specifically focusing on building a mechanistic understanding of ecological fire effects through quantifying the spatial and temporal patterns of fire energy release. His training and prior work has given him expertise in plant ecology, ecophysiology, conservation science, and forest management. He has worked on fire management globally with ongoing projects in several Latin American and Caribbean nations.
Hi, my name is Joe O-Brien. I'm the project leader of the Athens Prescribed Fire Science Lab, part of the Southern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. And today I'm going to be telling you about our strategy and approach for using QUIC-Fire to predict fire effects. So let's give a little background on why we decided that we thought it was important to connect QUIC-Fire to fire effects. The reason is that the entire effort behind QUIC-Fire and the associated 3D fuels is that we needed more realistic representations of fire to better guide the application of fire to the landscape. That is, using fire to solve a problem, not seeing fire as a problem. And informing that decision is important because what we're doing with fire is managing vegetation, and that is an ecological activity. So we're using fire as an ecological process to manipulate the landscape to either reduce fuels, which is reduce vegetation living or dead, or to improve habitat quality for certain species, or just to maintain ecosystem function and processes. So prescribed fire has a foundation in ecology, and fire effects, although there are physical fire effects, they're mostly rooted in the concept of ecology and using fire to manipulate the ecological trajectory of ecosystems. So as you've seen from the prior talks, and for those of you who manipulate fire for a living, the entire realm of fire is complex. That is because nature is complex. Vegetation is complex in structure and composition. It varies in time and space. The fuels that are derived from that vegetation are complex. The fire that consumes those fuels and the influence of those fuels and the vegetation on the fire behavior itself is complex. And the actual impact of the fire, the heat transfer from the fire on the ecosystem and the components of the ecosystem are as complex or even more so. So we have this kind of overarching complexity that can seem almost insurmountable. But we feel like we have an approach, as you've heard earlier, that can handle that complexity. And instead of complaining about it or trying to ignore it, we embrace it. So by accepting and embracing variation in 3 dimensions and exploiting technology that can capture and characterize that variation, we can now start to approach modeling fire effects similarly. And by using a mechanistic approach where we look at the mechanism of heat transfer and the impact of heat transfer on tissues and organisms, we can start to build a relationship that can connect these state-of-the-art next-generation fire behavior models to ecological fire effects. This is important because, as I mentioned, prescribed fire management is vegetation management. So by being able to game or create scenarios for ignition patterns, for example, we can look at whether we're going to get the ecological effects we want, whether those ecological effects are fuel reduction or habitat maintenance. And our approach, which I'll get into in more detail in a second, is to exploit the modular framework that we've built QUIC-Fire and 3D vegetation around. Here we see a schematic of the modular approach we've taken with our actual modeling efforts. The broader concept of our approach includes not only spatial applications of these models, but how we connect these models themselves. So for example, here we see QUIC-Fire and 3D vegetation as modeling domains that act as the base of potential expansions into fire effects, and then how fire effects can interact with the QUIC-Fire domain and the 3D vegetation domain. But what we hope to do is be able to create a seamless framework where we can expand outputs from different models and have them interact in this spatially explicit and modular way. Okay, so maybe I'm guilty of packing a few too many adjectives into the title here, but they're all important. So the concepts of these model hubs or modules, they can also be nested across scales, and they all interact. So here we have an example of the potential to use the fire effects predictions of QUIC-Fire to predict entire landscape scale impacts of a prescribed fire program, for example. So we have the plot level, the very fine scale, the square foot scale, square decimeter scale interactions that we can capture with some of our subgrid elements in QUIC-Fire, and then also the ecological theory that goes into those. Then we can scale them up to stand level, and then we can apply those stand level models to an entire landscape. The reason why QUIC-Fire is so critical for this whole effort in producing realistic fire effects predictions is because it's a coupled fire atmosphere model. We can start to examine different ignition strategies and what the impacts of those different ignition strategies are fire behavior and then the subsequent fire effects. So here we see a zoomed in portion of a QUIC-Fire run on some actual fuels in the Piedmont at the Hitchity Experimental Forest. And what you see here, which was really exciting to me, was not only very realistic fire behavior, but a spatially explicit map of energy release. And now we could take that energy release as our sort of raw material for predicting fire effects. But we have some things we have to do before we do that. The idea of being able to take fire energy and treat it as a dose in a biological dose response framework is really allowed us to take a quantum leap into taking QUIC-Fire outputs or even fire measurements themselves and understanding what they're going to do to both organisms and forest community dynamics. This approach came out of some colleagues of mine at the University of Idaho and others, and it's really allowed us to have a path forward to come up with solutions to what has been a very difficult problem. So key to the dose response approach is understanding thresholds. So in this case, I'm going to give you two examples of where we've gone out and used both theoretical and empirical approaches to develop parameters that describe dose thresholds. For example, a direct effect, that is the direct effect of heat transfer on stems in order to cause above ground mortality, what we call top kill. And then also to look at an even more powerful approach to using the dose response, where we understand the secondary effects of fire on entire community assembly, how forests structure themselves. So an important direct effect of fire is the concept of top kill. That is, fire is often used to control woody vegetation in many parts of the Southeast. And understanding what kinds of vegetation can be controlled with fire or not controlled could be predicted if we understood the thermal properties of those stems, and we could start to make predictions about how managers could tune their ignition patterns to accomplish their goal of killing above ground stems of, say, sweet gum. So we took a mechanistic approach, meaning we quantified the dynamics of heat transfer into stems of different sizes and different properties. And what we can do with that kind of mechanistic knowledge of how heat transfer impacts tissues is make predictions about how different levels of fuels and fire intensity can affect mortality of stems and predict top kill. So for example, here we've overlaid the lethal dose threshold of loblolly pine in the blue and sweet gum on the red with the fuel accumulation that would occur over 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, and 10 years, and what we would expect in terms of the size of trees that would be killed if all the energy in those fuels were released. And we can see that sweet gum is more susceptible to top kill than loblolly pine due to bark structural characteristics. And by parameterizing these things, we can then connect it to our other models and start to make predictions at larger scales across landscapes that can help managers game ignition scenarios, for example. So we've been able to take a similar approach with an indirect effect. The association between frequent fire and high biological diversity in many ecosystems in the Southeast is long been observed, but never really completely understood. And by taking a mechanistic dose response approach, we have been able to predict how fire energy release drives community assembly, a very complicated process that's built on ecological theory, but yet can be tied to QUIC-Fire through its spatially explicit outputs of energy release. And I'll give you a brief example of how we're going to be able to use this approach to game how management might impact biological diversity. And what we've learned is that by mapping the spatial variation in fuels that can be connected to the spatial variation of canopies of trees that can be mapped across landscapes, we can make predictions about how entire plant communities maintain themselves and assemble themselves. And these are some heat maps of fire energy release. One measured underneath a pine tree, those hot spots are cones, and on the smaller graph to the right, we have predicted fire energy release from QUIC-Fire. By taking this information and applying some ecological theory, we can actually reconstruct communities and show how fire maintains them. So tying it all back together. So what we want to do is be able to predict fire effects from QUIC-Fire outputs so we can start to examine scenarios of how landscape management might impact various processes, from biological diversity to inhibiting competing vegetation to ecosystem carbon dynamics. And because we've taken a modular, spatially explicit three-dimensional approach, we can expand and contract the questions that we're looking at and the solutions to those questions in almost an infinite way. And we feel like this approach is extremely powerful. It's shown itself to be extremely useful already, and the potential is really exciting. What we need to do, and the work that remains ahead of us, is to parameterize some of these relationships. But that's a much simpler problem than devising a framework or devising an entire approach. So I'm really excited about the potential for this process. And at some point, we're going to be limited by questions. So manager interaction, co-production, what kinds of questions need solutions will be really important for guiding the development of future modules that we can tack on to our framework. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to answer questions live, but I promise I will answer all questions via email. And if there's any time, Kevin Hires is pretty well versed in our approach, and he can take your questions. And I appreciate your time, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.